When we read John chapter 21, it's very immediately apparent that Jesus is focusing his attention on one person, the Apostle Peter. And given Peter's denial of our Lord, that's not really surprising to us. But it's also true that this text is for each one of us. When you read Peter's own words in 1 Peter chapter 5, he takes many of the truths that he learns from our Lord Jesus in this incident, and he passes them along to us. So let's pay attention to this story in John chapter 5, that fishing story that brings wonder to our minds as we think about it, and we wish we were there. It's a lesson for all of us, I believe. It's a story that has remembrances of early events. When we listen to the story in Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus teaching alongside the Sea of Galilee, and he looks over and he sees one of the ships there, one of the small boats that belongs to Peter, and Peter and the others are washing their nets. And he says to Peter, "I'd like to borrow your boat." And so he has him launch it out far enough to speak to the crowds along the shore. And after Jesus is finished teaching, he says to Peter, "Take your boat out to deep water for a catch of fish." And Peter, of course, the professional fisherman, tries to instruct Jesus about how fish and when fish need to be caught. They were out all night and they had caught nothing. Nevertheless, Peter obeys Jesus, perhaps under protest. And so as they take the boat out and they lower their nets, you remember a great harvest of fish come, so much that the nets tear, and when they fill the boats, they almost begin to sink. And Peter falls down at Jesus' feet and says, "Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." That story is the beginning, I think, of the disciples following Jesus full time. From that time on, they left their boats, they left their nets, and they followed Jesus. But time has passed. Jesus has finished his earthly ministry. He has been crucified and raised from the dead. And now we find ourselves in this 40-day period where Jesus appears intermittently to his disciples. But it's not like it used to be. It's not Jesus having constant fellowship, constant reunion with his disciples and going everywhere together. He comes and goes. And the disciples are wondering what lies ahead for them. So Peter, I think perhaps in boredom or frustration or whatever, says, "I'm going fishing." That's the one thing Peter thought he knew how to do. 6 of his colleagues said, "We're going with you." And so out they went to fish. And as was their practice, they fished all night unsuccessfully. It's just beginning to dawn, and the disciples are making their way apparently in the boat, and probably there's a mist on the lake, and they look out and they see someone on the shore some distance away, about a football field length away, and they see someone with a fire that is cooking some food, and that person stands up and he says something that's very familiar to me. "You didn't catch anything, did you?" That's what my wife always said to me when I went salmon fishing. And the next thing she said was, "Why don't you quit?" Well, Jesus was right. They hadn't caught anything, and probably because he had prevented it. And so he says to them, "Cast your nets on the right-hand side of the boat." Now it's interesting to notice that at this stage, they don't know who is speaking to them. They must assume that he has some knowledge of where the fish might be, and so without protest, they do as he says, and you know there's a great harvest of fish. 153 when they count them up. It's at that point in the game that John leans over to Peter and says, apparently not in the hearing of the others, "This is Jesus." Peter immediately responds as Peter typically does. He girds himself with an outer garment and he jumps overboard and begins to make his way toward shore. Eventually the others get to shore as well, and you remember Peter takes the net and he draws it up onto shore. What's interesting is there are no sinking boats as they were in Luke chapter 5, and there are no torn nets. But rather the fish are brought up. Jesus already has fish and bread in preparation. He's got breakfast ready and waiting, as it were, but he has them bring some of the fish that they have caught and add it to the fire, and then he serves them breakfast. What a breakfast meeting that must have been. So Jesus then gives the disciples this incredible event, and still there is that feeling amongst the disciples, is this really Jesus or not? Have you ever been in a room with somebody and you know their face, you know that you know them, but you just can't remember their name? Well, there's that uneasiness on the part of the disciples. They're saying to themselves, it looks like Jesus, but is it really him? But they're afraid to ask. So Jesus then teaches some lessons, I think, from this very interesting fishing story, lessons that I think we need to keep in mind as we go forward, some of us as leaders, but all of us as Christians, surely as followers. The first thing we ought to observe is this is a replay. This is a replay of Luke chapter 5, and in that sense, it's a reconfirmation of the calling of the disciples to the life of one who follows Jesus full time. And so as they go through this event, it's kind of deja vu in the minds of the disciples. Haven't we been here before? And so they are recommissioned, as it were, by this event, reminded of the call that God has given them, and encouraged to press on, even in the midst of these new circumstances and in these challenging times that lay ahead of them. I think the second thing I see is a reassurance of our Lord's presence. Jesus was there even when they didn't know it. Jesus was watching. In fact, I think Jesus was controlling. I think Jesus was there preventing the fish from getting to their nets as they worked all night long. But Jesus was there even when they did not perceive it. And that's going to be the reality of the disciples in their ministry and their lives as the future comes on. They're going to be going on. Jesus is going to be absent from them, not the way that he used to be present with them on a day-to-day basis. And so the disciples are reassured Jesus is with us even when we don't perceive him to be there. Jesus is there. Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. They were not left to themselves. I think the third thing we see is that Jesus is assuring them of his abundant provision. Whenever Jesus provided food, he never provided a small quantity of it. Whether that was the feeding of the 5,000, whether it was the feeding of the 4,000, or whether we have this feeding, there was more than enough food. And there were certainly more than enough fish. Jesus was indicating to his disciples that when they follow him, he will not only be with them, but that he will provide abundantly for them. They had a bigger catch, I think, than the first time. And certainly the boats didn't sink and the nets didn't tear. And I do think, by the way, as they are sitting there having this breakfast of bread and fish, I wonder if it went through the minds of the disciples to think, I wonder if this is somewhat like the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus abundantly provides. The next thing I observe from this text is that being a disciple, being a follower of Jesus, involves evangelism. It necessitates evangelism. I see this text as a kind of commentary on the Great Commission that our Lord gave in Matthew chapter 28. And one of the things that's essential for a disciple of our Lord Jesus is to catch fish. That is, to evangelize, to lead men and women to faith in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ. The fifth thing I see is this. When we pursue our own agenda within our own strength, it never works. All that night of fishing was fruitless. And the reason was that it was initiated by Peter for the wrong reasons, not by our Lord. And it was carried out in the strength of the flesh. Remember, Jesus said to them, wait until the Spirit comes upon you to empower you. So the disciples were going about their mission in their strength with their abilities. And this text reminds us, when we do that, it will not be fruitful. So my question for you is this. We live in a day when we have not seen Jesus, when we have not walked with him. How near do you perceive Jesus to be? Jesus says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. That is as true for us today as it was for the disciples then. This text should encourage us that Jesus is there, He is with us even when we do not perceive that to be the case. We may live in a day when we think our resources are few, but the reality is our Lord's resources are always abundant. When He provides for us, He provides more than enough. And He makes that clear by that provision of fish. I wonder if we need a refresher course in our own call. This particular event was a renewal, I believe, of the call for the apostles, for the disciples. After Jesus had been crucified and raised from the dead, and now soon to be ascended to the Father, there was a question in their minds, what do we do now? And I think this event says to the disciples, you do what you were called to do. For some of us, our salvation may have occurred many years ago. For some of us, our sense of calling may have happened many, many days or years ago. But the question for each one of us is simply this: do we remember the call? And are we still serving Him the way He called us to do? If so, we are assured of His presence, we are assured of His abundant provision, and we are assured of fruitfulness because it is His work done to His glory.